Good evening and welcome back to the Dusty Feet. It's June 30th, right? 2026. And we're continuing our Outside the Class series as we walk through this first scroll of First Kings. We're following the larger story of the TaNaK, right? The Hebrew Bible. And as always, our purpose here is not to rush through a chapter, right? We're not trying to collect Bible trivia. We're slowing down. We're watching the story unfold and we're asking how the pieces connect, right? We're trying to listen for the voice of God inside the movement of this story about Israel. Tonight, we come to 1 Kings chapter 9. So please, again, for context, go read or listen to 1 Kings chapter 9 because, well, it's our launch point. And this chapter comes immediately after one of the highest moments in Israel's history. In the previous chapter, right, chapter 8, Solomon had dedicated the temple. The house of Yahweh was completed. The Ark of the Covenant was brought into the inner sanctuary. The glory cloud filled the house. Yep. And Solomon prayed this beautiful prayer, asking that Yahweh would hear his people. As they prayed towards this place, he prayed for forgiveness. He prayed for justice. He prayed for the foreigner. He prayed for Israel in exile even before exile had happened. And then after that, the people celebrated, right? So chapter 8 ends with worship, feasting, blessing, joy. This is a mountaintop moment. But then chapter 8 begins with something that maybe we need to pay a little attention to. Because after the celebration comes a response. Because after Solomon speaks to God, well, God speaks to Solomon. And what God says is both beautiful and probably sobering. So let's sit back, relax, and wander a Dusty Feet path as we go through 1 Kings chapter 9. The Dusty Feet. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. DustyFeet.com. That's our primary place for everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. Designed around the written and spoken text, it's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at Dusty Feet Journey. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. And as always, 4. You're welcome to send an email to Bob at TheDustyFeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we jump back in, a quick reminder, if you find these discussions useful, please click the subscribe button. And if you think someone else might enjoy exploring scriptures the way that we do here, that's when you hit the like button, because it really does help people discover this series and the other series we have on the Dusty Feet. Because along this road, we're going to ask a lot of questions about all kinds of things, questions about the text, its context and history. We're going to ask about people, choices, pattern, meaning. Answers? We'll see where the dusty path leads. So, this chapter 9, it opens by telling us that Solomon had finished building the house of Yahweh. He finished the king's house. Basically, he built everything that he wanted to build. I think that section matters. Solomon completed the major building projects. The temple is now finished. The palace is finished. The infrastructure of the kingdom, right? It's expanding. So on the surface, everything looks successful. Israel's at peace. The king is wise. The temple stands in Jerusalem. The nations are beginning to notice. Don't forget, that is also part of the covenant promise to Abraham. We're watching that unfold, but the biblical story still asks us to pause, to look deeper, maybe what's going on the surface at the time. Because I think in this season, I think success can be a very dangerous part of this story. When life is falling apart, we know we need God, right? When the enemies are at the gate, that's when we know to cry out. When the wilderness is hungry and dry, right, we look for manna and water. But when the buildings are finished, when the gold is stacked, the borders are secure, the name is famous, then, well, that's when the heart can drift in a dangerous season. So God appears to Solomon a second time, just as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. That first appearance came much earlier in Solomon's tale when he was just young in his kingship. And God asked him, "What do you want?" Solomon asked for wisdom. He asked actually for a listening heart so he could govern the people rightly. It's a good beginning. But now many years have passed. Solomon is now well established. He's no longer simply this young son of David asking for wisdom. He's now a kingdom builder. He's now an administrator. He's the ruler of this growing, flourishing kingdom. And Yahweh speaks to him again. And he says, in essence, I've heard your prayer, right? God hears it. And then he consecrates this place, right? His name is going to be there. His name will be carried there. I think if you go listen to our third commandment episode, this echoes all fits in here. And his eyes and his heart are going to be there. God's eyes and hearts are going to be there continually. That's a beautiful statement. It's almost a touching statement, because Yahweh's saying that the temple, it's not just about the project. It's not architecture. It's not this monument. It's a sacred space set apart for his name. Okay, we've talked about this before. I think it's worth repeating. In the biblical world, the name of God, it's not just a label. The name represents character, his authority, his reputation, his presence among his people. God is saying that this place will be his meeting point for this. This is going to be a place of prayer. It's going to be a place of covenant remembrance. It's a place where Israel can turn their attention toward him. This is that place where heaven and earth overlap in a unique way. It's like the tabernacle and other things we've seen in Scripture. And then that's when he makes that phrase, when God says, my eyes and my heart are going to be there. This is tender, right? This is his eyes, his seeing, his heart. He cares. This is not a cold deity managing religious procedures from like a long ways away. This is the covenant God of Israel, choosing to dwell among his people, to hear them, to see them, to bind them to his heart. But as we read, then comes the warning. And this is, I think, where the chapter starts to turn. When God tells Solomon that if he will walk before him as David his father walked, with the integrity of his heart and uprightness, obeying his statutes and judgments, then Solomon's throne, well, it will also be established. The promise to David will continue. There will not fail to be a man from David's line on the throne of Israel. But then God says, if you turn aside. And I think we really need to hear that. We really need to remember that that is also a promise. It's a promise too. If you turn aside. Because the temple didn't remove the need for obedience. The building does not replace covenant faithfulness, right? The temple's a blessing, but it's not a magic shield. Israel can't say, we have the temple, therefore nothing can happen to us. I mean, Solomon doesn't get to say, I built the house of Yahweh, therefore my heart no longer needs to be guarded. It's obvious. Covenant still matters. Commands still matter. Justice still matters. Loyalty to God still matters. And then Yahweh, he made it plain. He made it clear what the consequences were. Our God is a promise-keeping God. He said, if Solomon or his descendants, if they turn away, if they stop keeping the commandments, if they go and serve other gods and they bow down to them, that's when Israel will be cut off from the land. And we, again, should hear echoes of Deuteronomy 30. The house itself, though it's consecrated right now, it can become a ruin. People, when they're passing by, they're going to look at that ruined place. They're going to be astonished. And they're going to ask, why has Yahweh done this to his land and his house? And the answer, it's in his promise. It's because they abandoned Yahweh their God who brought their forefathers out of Egypt and they went after other gods. I mean, that is a major theme. That continues throughout the Bible. Exodus is the foundation. God delivered Israel out of Egypt. He brought them out of slavery. He made covenant with them. He gave them Torah. He gave them land. He gave them the kingship. He gave them his presence. So to turn from him after all that, that's not a small thing. That is covenant betrayal. That hurts. And we should take heed. And this warning from 1 Kings chapter 9, it prepares us for the entire rest of the story, as we say, right? Because remember, we can't already cheat. We know what's coming because we know that 1st and 2nd Kings, we know the direction they're heading. The kingdom will divide. Israel in the north will fall to Assyria eventually. Judah in the south will fall to Babylon eventually. Jerusalem will be destroyed. The temple will burn. The people will all go into exile. And we're just hearing the terms of the story that will eventually unfold. And I think we need to listen and heed. Because I think we can do the very same thing, right? We have our religious buildings, religious language, religious music, religious traditions, religious routines. And yet we still have hearts that are drifting from God. We can appear successful, still be spiritually compromised. We can be busy building things for God. And underneath, we're just quietly failing to walk with God. I think that's one of the warnings of Solomon's life, right? He builds the house of Yahweh, but later it's his heart that's pulled away. He has wisdom, but that wisdom must be obeyed. We need to listen and heed this. He has knowledge, but knowledge must become faithfulness because he has a calling, but that calling will not override Solomon's own character. So the chapter begins with divine mercy and divine warning, right? They're sitting side by side. They're sitting right next to each other. God hears Solomon's prayer. God consecrates the temple. God promises continuity. And at the same time, he also warns that the future of the kingdom depends on their covenant faithfulness. Everyone. And then the chapter shifts into Solomon's dealings with Hiram. Not the builder Hiram we just had, but we're back to the king of Tyre. So Hiram had helped Solomon with the materials for the temple, right, to build this beautiful place. He supplied the cedar, cypress, gold. He played a major role in these building projects. And now, after 20 years, Solomon gives Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So when Hiram goes to see these cities, he's not impressed, right? He calls them Kabul, which seems to carry the idea of being worthless, displeasing, good for nothing. And when I heard that, I hear an echo of those few places in the Messiah's life that were in Galilee. And well, I think if we remember right, the same ideas applied even in his day. So echoes beware. Okay, so we're not given every detail here. We get that. But the scene that we're setting here, it started to feel awkward. Because Solomon gives Hiram these cities. Hiram looks at them and he basically says, what are these? Right? That moment introduces another subtle concern in the chapter. It's another question. Solomon's kingdom is glorious, but how is he financing the glory? I mean, what's the cost? What's being traded away? The story is just starting to invite more and more questions. Because earlier in the Solomon narrative, we saw his wisdom, we saw his prayer, we saw the beauty of the temple, but as we move forward, we're starting to see shadows. And this is a big one of them. Solomon's partner with Hiram is not necessarily wrong in and of itself, right? David had dealings with Hiram. The nations bringing resources for the house of Yahweh. That can actually be seen as a picture of the nations recognizing Israel's God. But this when you're hearing the story, the tone's different. Cities in the land are being exchanged. Foreign alliances, they're expanding. Gold is flowing. Building projects are multiplying. So maybe the reader is meant to start wondering, is Solomon still operating as the servant king under Yahweh? Or is he beginning to look like the rest of the kings of these nations all around him? And I think that question gets louder and louder as we roll through the rest of the story of Solomon. Because the chapter then continues and it gives us a list of his building projects, right? Builds a house of God, builds his own house, builds the Milo, right? He builds the wall of Jerusalem. He builds Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. He builds Beth Horon, Balath, and Tamar in the wilderness. And he builds store cities, chariot cities, cities for horsemen. Whatever he desired to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, all the land in his domain he built. It's an impressive list. Solomon, he's not idle, right? He is this builder king. He develops cities. He strengthens defenses. He expands storage, right? He organizes military capacity. He reinforces the kingdom. And again, on the surface, this looks like success. But those words, chariot cities and horsemen, right? That should make our ears perk up. We've talked about this before because remember back in Deuteronomy 17, God gives instructions for Israel's future kings, right? The king must not multiply horses for himself. He must not cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. He must not multiply wives. He must not greatly multiply silver and gold. Instead, he is supposed to write for himself a copy of the Torah, and he needs to read it all the days of his life so that his heart will not be lifted above those of his brothers. So it seems that passage is I'll call it a measuring stick for Israel's kings all in the future. And Solomon is increasingly begins to look troubling, well, when reviewing that measuring stick. Yeah, chariots and horses represent military power. They represent security systems of the nations. So the question is not whether Israel could have any defense at all. That's not the question. The question here is, where is the king's trust resting? Is the king trusting God, or is he trusting his empire-style accumulation? More horses, more chariots, more gold, more wives, more alliances, more building, more control. Because the thing is, none of those things by themselves always look like, well, they don't look like rebellion at first. And I think that's what makes this drift so dangerous. Because it looks practical. It looks responsible. You could say it looks strategic, successful. But slowly, underneath, that is when the heart changes. Slowly, dependence on God becomes dependence on the systems. This covenant faithfulness becomes now it's political calculation. And now slowly, this king who asked for wisdom begins to collect the very things that Torah warned kings not to collect. Spiritual decline, it rarely announces itself with trumpets. I think Solomon's story warns us that a person can be gifted, he can be wise, he can be called, right? He can be successful. And you can still drift. And then the chapter also tells us about forced labor, right? The text says that Solomon did not make slaves of the Israelites. He did conscript the remaining people from the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Those were all the people who remained in the land that were around. And the Israelites, well, they had their job. They served as soldiers, officials, commanders, captains, chariot officers, the horsemen. So there is this distinction in the text between Israelites and non-Israelites. But the forced labor here raises a major theme. Because Israel was delivered from forced labor in Egypt. The Exodus story begins with Pharaoh enslaving people to build his store cities, right? And now here, in Solomon's kingdom, we're hearing about forced labor, store cities, chariot cities, large royal construction projects. Should sound familiar. I think the Bible is inviting us to compare Solomon's kingdom with Egypt. And again, it may not be full Pharaoh yet, but the echoes are there. And then later, after Solomon dies, this issue is what becomes one of the major reasons the kingdom divides. Because the people, they come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and they say, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten the hard service, we will serve you." So that means Solomon's glory had a burden attached to it. Somebody carried the weight, somebody else paid the cost, somebody felt the pressure of the king's projects. So that brings us to another question. What kind of kingdom is Solomon building? Is this a kingdom shaped by Yahweh's deliverance? Or is it slowly becoming a kingdom shaped by Pharaoh methods? That's an uncomfortable question, right? That's a dusty feet question, and I think it's a necessary question. Because Yahweh, he did not redeem Israel from Egypt so they could become Egypt with just better worship music. Yeah, he did not bring them out of bondage so their own kings could recreate these systems of domination with another sticker. Israel was meant to be different. They were meant to be a kingdom shaped by covenant, shaped by justice, mercy, Sabbath, generosity, and in particular, a loyalty to Yahweh their God. And the king was not supposed to stand above his brothers. His heart was supposed to be the one that was lifted up. He was supposed to be the chief servant under the rule of Yahweh. So I think that here is where Solomon's story becomes so complicated. Because when we look at Solomon, he is not presented as purely wicked, not even close. I mean, not at all. He loves God in so many ways. He builds the temple. He prays beautifully. He offers sacrifices. He organizes worship. But the cracks are forming. And I think the biblical narrator wants us to see both things at the same time, right? Solomon is glorious. Solomon's also dangerous. His kingdom is impressive, but his kingdom is beginning to carry the scent of Egypt. The puzzle pieces, they're being laid on the table, and I think now they're starting to form a picture. And then the chapter tells us that Solomon offered burnt offerings, peace offerings on the altar before Yahweh 3 times a year. I think this likely connects with the 3 pilgrimage festivals, the appointed times where Israel would gather before Yahweh. Those details are not given to us. So it appears that Solomon is still participating in worship. He's still honoring the altar. He's still connected to the temple system. This is part of what makes this chapter so real, makes it very realistic. Because spiritual drift does not always mean a person stops worshiping immediately. Sometimes the sacrifices continue, the songs continue, the festivals continue, outward rhythms continue. But underneath, it's the heart that's dividing, it's the heart that's drifting away. That's the sobering lesson here, right? Public worship and private compromise, they can exist side by side for a season. But they will split. And God, he always sees both of them. And I think that's why the warning at the beginning of the chapter is so important. Because God does not simply ask for rituals, he asks for loyalty. He asks for obedience. He asks for a whole heart. And he tells Solomon to walk before him as David walked. David was not sinless. I think it's important, right? David failed deeply, right? We saw, but David's heart returned to God. Always. David repented. Always. He did not abandon Yahweh for other gods. Never. David's life was messy, but his allegiances remained fixed. So when he calls Solomon to walk like David, he's not calling him to flawless performance. He's not calling him to repeat those things that he did. He's calling him to covenant loyalty. He's calling him to a heart that always thinks of returning, a heart that listens, a heart that refuses to bow to other gods. And it's a heart that doesn't use worship as a cover for his rebellion. The kingdom, it's becoming wealthy. The name of Solomon is spreading, the economy is growing, the machinery of the kingdom is working smoothly. And I have another question. Whose name is spreading? Solomon's or Yahweh's? Is this wealth a sign of blessing here? Or is this wealth gone from blessing and now it's becoming a test? Because biblically, wealth's not evil, right? Abraham had wealth. Job had wealth. David gathered the resources from the temple. There's a lot going on, but the issue is not simply possessions. The issue is trust. The issue is justice. The issue is allegiance. What does wealth do to your heart? Does it produce gratitude and generosity? Or does it produce pride and control, right? Does it deepen our dependence on God, or does it just quietly replace it? Because we know Deuteronomy warned that when Israel entered the land and they built good houses and they ate and were full and they multiplied the silver and gold, they must not forget Yahweh their God. They must never say in their heart, my power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth. And that very warning, right now it's hanging over Solomon. Because Solomon right now is living in the fullness of blessing. But I think the question is whether he's going to remember this giver. Is he going to honor the giver? Is he going to reflect the name of the giver? So it brings us back to the beginning of the chapter. Yahweh says, I've heard your prayer. He consecrates a house. He placed his name there. But then he says, walk before me. That's where I think that's the key. Walk. Not just build, not just rule, not just worship publicly, not just manage the kingdom. Walk with me. That language is deeply relational. That brings us back to Adam in the garden. It brings us back to Enoch walking with God, Noah walking with God, Abraham being told to walk before God and be blameless. The life of faith is a walk, step by step, daily direction, covenant loyalty over time. And I think that may be our strongest connection in this chapter, because the Dusty Feet's always been about the walk. It's not the destination. It's not the buildings. It's not the ministry. It's not the content. It's not knowledge. It's walk. Walking with God, listening. Are we returning? Are we guarding our hearts? Are we noticing the little compromises before they become these rather large collapses? Are we letting any success that happens, does it make us forget our dependence on God? Because those aren't questions just for Solomon, right? Those are questions that really are for us. All of Solomon's questions. The deeper question is, within Solomon, who was he becoming? Who are we becoming? Are we becoming people who walk before God? Are we the people whose hearts remain whole? Are we becoming people who remember that every good gift comes from him? This is not just a chapter about ancient building projects and foreign alliances. This is a mirror. And mirrors often, we carry mirrors here all the time on the Dusty Feet, all the time. It asks us to examine the subtle places where glory and compromise can live side by side for a season. And then it asks us to listen again to the voice of God. I've heard your prayer. My eyes and my heart are there. But you, walk before me. Walk before me. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. God's looking for faithful hearts. So may we be a people who build carefully, I think worship sincerely, repent quickly, walk humbly. May we not become so focused on the work of our hands that we forget the one who actually gave us breath. So thank you for joining me here on the Dusty Feet tonight. If this conversation's been meaningful to you, please feel free to subscribe, share it with someone, help them continue their journey with us. And until next time, stay curious, stay humble, and shalom, shalom.